John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut, the son of Junius Spencer Morgan, a prosperous merchant and banker, and Juliette Pierpont, a woman from a well-established New England family with roots in the commercial and religious life of the region. He was not born into old aristocracy, not a descendant of the landed gentry that still held sway in European society, and not heir to any political dynasty. His family belonged instead to the upper tier of American commercial life, respectable, educated, and solidly Presbyterian, with money earned through trade and finance rather than inherited through bloodlines. Hartford in the 1830s was a growing center of insurance and commerce, and the Morgans occupied a comfortable place within that world, though not yet an exceptional one. Young Pierpont, as he was known in the family, grew up in a household that valued discipline, religious observance, and above all, success in business. Junius Morgan had established himself as a partner in a dry goods firm and later moved into merchant banking, a shift that would define the trajectory of his son's life. In 1854, Junius accepted an invitation to join George Peabody and Company in London, one of the most respected American banking houses operating in Europe. George Peabody, a Massachusetts-born financier, had built his firm into a conduit for transatlantic capital, helping to channel British investment into American railroads, canals, and state bonds. When Junius Morgan moved his family across the Atlantic to take up this partnership, he brought his teenage son into direct contact with the world of international finance. Pierpont was enrolled in schools in Switzerland and Germany, where he received a rigorous education in mathematics, languages, and commerce. By the time he completed his studies at the University of Göttingen, he had been groomed not merely as a gentleman, but as a practitioner of the emerging discipline of modern banking. The Morgan family's relocation to London placed them at the center of a financial network that stretched from the counting houses of the City of London to the expanding railroad lines of the American Midwest. British capital was pouring into the United States during the mid-19th century, seeking returns in the rapid industrialization of a nation blessed with vast natural resources and an ever-growing population. The role of firms like George Peabody and Company was to mediate between these two worlds, assessing risk, arranging loans, and ensuring that capital flowed where it could be most profitably employed. Junius Morgan learned this trade under Peabody's exacting guidance, and he ensured that his son understood it as well. When Pierpont returned to the United States in 1857 to begin his career, he carried with him not only a European education, but also an intimate understanding of how money moved across oceans and how reputations were built on trust. Pierpont Morgan's first position in New York was as a junior accountant at Duncan, Sherman and Company, the American correspondent of George Peabody and Company. He was 20 years old, tall, somewhat awkward in manner, and possessed of a severe facial condition that would later become more pronounced. His role was clerical, but he approached it with intensity and ambition. Within months of his arrival, the Panic of 1857 struck the American economy, triggered by the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company and the collapse of speculative investments in railroads and western lands. Banks failed across the country, businesses shuttered, and unemployment spread through the industrial cities of the Northeast. For a young man just entering the world of finance, the Panic offered a brutal education in the fragility of credit and the speed with which confidence could evaporate. Morgan observed how firms that had overextended themselves were wiped out, while those with strong capital reserves and conservative lending practices survived. He saw how rumors could precipitate runs on banks, and how the absence of any central monetary authority left the financial system vulnerable to cascading failures. These lessons stayed with him. In the immediate aftermath of the Panic, he also demonstrated a willingness to act independently and aggressively. In one early episode, he purchased an entire shipment of coffee on speculation when he learned that the market was undersupplied, reselling it at a substantial profit. The transaction was unauthorized and drew criticism from his superiors, but it revealed a disposition that would characterize his later career, a readiness to seize opportunity, a confidence in his own judgment, and a tolerance for risk when he believed the odds favored him. In 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War transformed the economic landscape of the United States. The federal government, suddenly confronted with a need to finance a massive military effort, turned to the bond markets to raise the necessary funds. The Union would ultimately spend over $3 billion prosecuting the war, a sum unprecedented in American history. For the banking community, this represented both an opportunity and a test. Firms that could successfully place government bonds with investors stood to earn substantial commissions, while those that misjudged the market or failed to attract buyers risked ruin. Junius Morgan, now fully in control of what had become J.S. Morgan and Company following George Peabody's retirement, played a crucial role in marketing Union bonds to European investors. His son, meanwhile, established his own firm in New York, initially called J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, operating in coordination with his father's London house. The war years were formative for the younger Morgan. He did not serve in the Union Army, having paid a substitute to take his place, a legal practice common among wealthy men of the era but one that later drew criticism. Instead, he focused on building his business. His firm engaged in a variety of wartime transactions, some of which attracted controversy. In one notorious episode, Morgan helped finance the sale of obsolete carbines to the Union Army, weapons that had been declared unfit for service but were resold to field commanders at inflated prices. The so-called Hall carbine affair became a minor scandal and would be cited by Morgan's critics for decades afterward as evidence of his willingness to profit from the misfortunes of others. Morgan himself maintained that his involvement had been limited and that the transaction was not improper under the circumstances, but the episode illustrated the murky ethical terrain of wartime commerce. By the end of the Civil War in 1865, the United States had been fundamentally transformed. Slavery had been abolished, the political supremacy of the industrial North had been secured, and the federal government had demonstrated its capacity to mobilize resources on a scale previously unimaginable. The war had also accelerated the growth of the railroad network, as the strategic importance of rapid transportation became evident to military planners and investors alike. In 1862, Congress had passed the Pacific Railroad Acts, authorizing the construction of a transcontinental railroad and providing land grants and loans to the companies that would build it. This was the beginning of a new era in American capitalism, one in which the federal government would actively promote industrial development while simultaneously creating opportunities for private profit on an enormous scale. Morgan recognized that railroads would be the dominant industry of the post-war period. They required vast amounts of capital, far more than any individual investor could provide, and they generated complex financial structures involving stocks, bonds, mortgages, and land grants. They also tended toward instability, as competing lines built parallel routes, engaged in ruinous rate wars, and frequently collapsed into bankruptcy. For a banker with access to capital and the ability to coordinate among investors, the railroad industry offered unparalleled opportunities. Morgan began to position himself as an intermediary between the railroad companies and the financial markets, a role that would eventually make him the most powerful figure in American finance. In 1871, Morgan formed a new partnership with Anthony Drexel, the head of Drexel and Company, a prominent Philadelphia banking house with strong connections to the federal government. The new firm, Drexel, Morgan and Company, was headquartered at 23 Wall Street in New York, directly across from the New York Stock Exchange. The partnership combined Drexel's established reputation and government connections with Morgan's transatlantic network and aggressive instincts. Together, they built a firm capable of underwriting the largest financial transactions of the era. Within a few years, Drexel, Morgan and Company had become the leading investment bank in the United States, specializing in railroad securities and government bonds. The 1870s were a turbulent decade for the American economy. The rapid expansion of the railroad network had been financed largely through speculation and debt, and by 1873, the system was overextended. The failure of J. Cook and Company, the most prominent banking house in the country, triggered a financial panic that spread rapidly through the banking system. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days. Banks failed by the dozens. Railroads went bankrupt. The Panic of 1873 initiated a prolonged economic depression that lasted for most of the decade, bringing widespread unemployment, labor unrest, and social dislocation. For Morgan, the crisis was both a setback and an opportunity. Drexel, Morgan and Company survived the panic intact, its conservative lending practices and strong capital reserves shielding it from the worst effects. As weaker competitors failed, Morgan's firm grew stronger, absorbing business that had previously gone elsewhere. More importantly, the Depression created conditions in which Morgan could begin to reshape the railroad industry according to his own vision. Bankrupt railroads needed to be reorganized, their debts restructured, their operations rationalized. This process, which came to be known as Morganization, would become the defining feature of his career. It involved far more than simply arranging financing. It meant taking control of companies, installing new management, eliminating wasteful competition, and imposing discipline on an industry that had grown chaotically and without coordination. Morgan's approach to railroad reorganization was systematic and often ruthless. When a railroad failed, its bondholders faced the prospect of substantial losses. Morgan would offer to reorganize the company, exchanging old bonds for new securities at reduced values, eliminating unprofitable lines, and merging competing roads into larger, more efficient systems. In exchange for these services, Morgan's firm collected substantial fees and often gained seats on the reorganized company's board of directors. Over time, Morgan accumulated influence over a growing network of railroads, not through direct ownership but through the power that came from controlling access to capital. Railroad executives understood that alienating Morgan could mean being shut out of the bond markets, and they learned to accommodate his demands. The railroad industry that Morgan sought to reorganize in the 1870s and 1880s was a sprawling, chaotic enterprise that had grown without any central plan or coordination. By 1880, the United States possessed more miles of railroad track than all of Europe combined, a network that stretched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific coast and penetrated into nearly every corner of the continent. This extraordinary expansion had been financed by a combination of government subsidies, foreign investment, and domestic speculation, and it had produced a system characterized by redundancy, inefficiency, and savage competition. Rival lines built parallel tracks through the same territories, competing for the same traffic and driving rates so low that neither could earn a profit. When one company cut its prices, its competitors matched the reduction, initiating rate wars that continued until one or more of the combatants collapsed into bankruptcy. The consequences of this competition extended far beyond the railroad companies themselves. Farmers who shipped their grain to market found that freight rates fluctuated wildly from week to week, making it impossible to plan their operations or predict their income. Manufacturers faced similar uncertainty, never knowing whether the cost of transporting their goods would make them competitive or price them out of the market. Investors who had purchased railroad bonds discovered that the securities they held were backed by companies that might be solvent one year and bankrupt the next. The instability of the railroad industry infected the entire economy, contributing to the cycles of boom and bust that characterized the Gilded Age. Morgan believed that this chaos was unnecessary and destructive. He had observed how the British railway system operated, with its relatively stable rates and its absence of the cutthroat competition that plagued American lines. He understood that railroads possessed characteristics that made them fundamentally different from other businesses. They required enormous capital investments that could not easily be recovered if a line failed. They operated in markets where the entry of a new competitor could destroy the profitability of existing carriers. And they provided a service that was essential to the functioning of the entire economy, giving them a quasi-public character that justified, in Morgan's view, a degree of organization and coordination that would not be appropriate in other industries. The mechanism through which Morgan imposed order on the railroad industry was the reorganization of bankrupt companies. When a railroad failed, it entered receivership, a legal process in which a court-appointed receiver took control of its assets and operations while its creditors negotiated over how to divide whatever value remained. This process was typically protracted, contentious, and destructive. Receiverships could last for years, during which time the railroad continued to operate but could not make necessary investments or respond effectively to competitive pressures. Creditors fought among themselves for priority. Bondholders accused stockholders of looting the company, and everyone suspected everyone else of acting in bad faith. Morgan offered an alternative. When he undertook to reorganize a bankrupt railroad, he assembled the principal creditors and persuaded them to accept a comprehensive plan that would restructure the company's debts, provide new capital for necessary improvements, and establish a governance structure designed to prevent the mistakes that had led to bankruptcy in the first place. The key to this process was Morgan's ability to command the confidence of the major investors. When Morgan announced that he was reorganizing a railroad, bondholders understood that the plan he proposed was the best they were likely to receive, and that rejecting it would mean years of litigation and further losses. They also understood that Morgan would ensure that the reorganized company had access to the capital it needed to succeed, because his own reputation depended on the success of the companies he reorganized. The first major test of Morgan's approach came with the reorganization of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the aftermath of the Panic of 1873. The Baltimore and Ohio was one of the oldest railroads in the country, dating to 1827, and it had played a crucial role in opening the Western territories to commerce. But by the mid-1870s, it was struggling under the weight of excessive debt and the pressure of competition from newer, more efficient lines. Morgan negotiated a restructuring that reduced the company's fixed charges, provided new capital for improvements, and placed representatives of the bondholders on the board of directors. The reorganization was successful, and the Baltimore and Ohio emerged as a stable, profitable enterprise. More importantly, the process established a model that Morgan would apply, with variations, to dozens of other railroads over the following decades. The late 1870s also brought Morgan into conflict with some of the most powerful figures in American business. Jay Gould, a financier of legendary cunning and few scruples, had assembled a railroad empire through a combination of stock manipulation, bribery, and ruthless competition. Gould controlled the Union Pacific, the Missouri Pacific, and a web of smaller lines that gave him influence over transportation across much of the western United States. His methods were the antithesis of Morgan's. Where Morgan sought stability and order, Gould thrived on chaos. Where Morgan built relationships based on trust and long-term commitment, Gould exploited every opportunity for short-term gain. The two men represented fundamentally different visions of American capitalism, and their rivalry would shape the development of the railroad industry for years to come. In 1879, Morgan demonstrated his growing power in a confrontation with Gould over control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, a small but strategically important line that connected the Erie Railroad to the New England network. Gould and his ally James Fisk had attempted to seize control of the Albany and Susquehanna through a combination of stock purchases and legal maneuvers, but they were opposed by a group of investors who turned to Morgan for assistance. Morgan organized the resistance, financed a proxy fight, and ultimately prevailed in a contest that involved not only legal battles but also physical confrontations between rival groups of workers. The victory established Morgan as a force capable of standing against even the most powerful speculators of the era. Throughout the 1880s, Morgan continued to extend his influence over the railroad industry. His firm participated in the reorganization of numerous lines, including the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, and the Richmond and West Point Terminal Company. Each reorganization followed a similar pattern. Morgan would assemble the creditors, negotiate a plan that reduced fixed charges and provided new capital, install his own representatives on the board, and demand that the reorganized company refrain from the competitive practices that had contributed to its failure. The railroads that emerged from Morgan's reorganizations were typically more stable and more profitable than their predecessors, but they were also less independent, bound by formal and informal agreements to coordinate their operations and avoid the destructive competition that Morgan abhorred. The culmination of Morgan's efforts to stabilize the railroad industry came in 1889, when he convened a meeting of the presidents of the major eastern railroads aboard his yacht, the Corsair. The purpose of the meeting was to negotiate an end to the rate wars that had plagued the industry for decades. Morgan proposed that the railroads form an association that would establish and maintain agreed-upon rates, divide traffic among the participating lines according to a fixed formula, and impose penalties on any company that violated the agreement. The proposal was unprecedented in its scope and ambition, and it reflected Morgan's conviction that the railroad industry could not function effectively without coordination at the highest level. The agreements reached aboard the Corsair, and at subsequent meetings were never entirely successful. The temptation to cheat was always present, and some railroad executives proved unable to resist the opportunity to capture traffic by secretly cutting rates. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 had created a federal commission with the authority to regulate railroad rates, and while the commission was initially weak and ineffective, its existence complicated efforts to maintain private rate agreements. Nevertheless, the Corsair meetings marked a turning point in the history of American railroads. They established the principle that the major carriers had shared interest in avoiding destructive competition, and they demonstrated that Morgan possessed the authority to bring the railroad presidents together and compel them to negotiate in good faith. By 1890, Morgan had become the dominant figure in American railroad finance. His firm had participated in the reorganization of lines representing a significant portion of the nation's total railroad mileage. He sat on the boards of numerous companies, either personally or through his partners, and his approval was required for any major financing in the industry. Railroad executives who wanted to raise capital understood that they needed Morgan's support, and they structured their operations accordingly. This concentration of power was unlike anything that had existed before in American business. Morgan was not a railroad operator, not a builder of lines, not even primarily an investor in railroad securities. He was a banker, and his power derived from his ability to control access to capital. The methods that Morgan employed in the railroad industry attracted criticism from the beginning. Farmers and shippers complained that the stabilization of rates meant higher prices for transportation services. Reformers argued that Morgan's reorganizations transferred wealth from stockholders to bondholders, benefiting the wealthy at the expense of small investors. Politicians accused Morgan of creating a money trust, a concentration of financial power that threatened democratic institutions and placed the economy under the control of a small group of bankers. Morgan himself dismissed these criticisms as the complaints of those who did not understand how business worked. He believed that the alternative to organization was chaos, that competition without coordination led inevitably to bankruptcy and collapse, and that his methods served the interests of everyone who depended on a stable and efficient transportation system. The decade of the 1890s would test Morgan's system as it had never been tested before. The Panic of 1893 struck with devastating force, triggering a depression that was even more severe than the downturn of the 1870s. Railroads that Morgan had reorganized went bankrupt again. Banks failed across the country. Unemployment reached levels not seen since the Civil War. In this crisis, Morgan would be called upon not merely to reorganize individual companies, but to stabilize the entire financial system, a role that would transform him from a powerful banker into something approaching a national institution. The Panic of 1893 began with the failure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad in February of that year, a collapse that sent shockwaves through the financial markets and initiated a cascade of bankruptcies that would ultimately claim more than 15,000 businesses and 500 banks. The Reading had been reorganized by Morgan's firm only a few years earlier, and its failure was a blow to his reputation as well as to the investors who had trusted his judgment. But the Reading was merely the first domino to fall. Within months, the Erie Railroad, the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe had all entered receivership. By the end of the year, nearly a quarter of the nation's railroad mileage was in bankruptcy, and the financial system was approaching a state of general collapse. The underlying causes of the panic were complex and had been building for years. The rapid expansion of the railroad network had created overcapacity in many regions, and the rate wars of the 1880s had left many companies with insufficient revenues to service their debts. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 had required the Treasury to purchase large quantities of silver, inflating the currency and creating uncertainty about the stability of the gold standard. European investors, alarmed by the monetary situation in the United States, began withdrawing their capital, draining gold reserves, and putting pressure on American banks. When the Reading failed, it triggered a loss of confidence that spread rapidly through the system, as depositors rushed to withdraw their funds and creditors demanded immediate payment of their loans. Morgan responded to the crisis with characteristic energy and determination. His firm took the lead in reorganizing the bankrupt railroads, applying the methods he had developed over the previous 2 decades on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. The reorganization of the Erie Railroad alone required months of negotiations among hundreds of creditors holding claims of varying priority and conflicting interests. Morgan's partners worked around the clock, drafting plans, negotiating compromises, and arranging the financing necessary to restore the bankrupt companies to solvency. By 1895, Morgan's firm had participated in the reorganization of railroads representing more than 30,000 miles of track, a substantial portion of the entire national network. The terms of these reorganizations reflected Morgan's priorities and his power. Bondholders were typically required to accept reductions in the face value of their securities, exchanging old bonds for new ones that paid lower interest rates and had longer maturities. Stockholders fared even worse, often seeing their shares diluted or eliminated entirely. In exchange for these sacrifices, the reorganized companies received infusions of new capital, obtained through bond issues underwritten by Morgan's firm. The fees and commissions generated by these transactions were substantial, making the Depression of the 1890s one of the most profitable periods in the history of Drexel, Morgan and Company. But Morgan's ambitions during this period extended beyond the reorganization of individual railroads. He sought to use the crisis as an opportunity to restructure the entire industry, consolidating competing lines into larger systems that would be less vulnerable to the destructive competition that had contributed to the panic. In the East, he promoted the merger of the Reading with the Lehigh Valley and the Central Railroad of New Jersey, creating a unified system that controlled the anthracite coal traffic from the Pennsylvania mines to the New York market. In the South, he reorganized the Richmond and Danville Railroad and its affiliated lines into the Southern Railway, a system that stretched from Washington to New Orleans and dominated transportation throughout the former Confederacy. These consolidations were controversial from the beginning. Critics argued that Morgan was creating monopolies that would exploit farmers and shippers by charging excessive rates. Supporters countered that consolidation was necessary to achieve the efficiencies that would allow the railroads to provide reliable service at reasonable prices. The debate over railroad consolidation would continue for decades, but in the context of the Depression, Morgan's arguments had considerable force. The alternative to consolidation, he insisted, was the continuation of the chaos that had produced the panic in the first place. Only by eliminating wasteful competition and coordinating the operations of the major systems could the railroads generate the revenues necessary to maintain their infrastructure and service their debts. The most dramatic episode of the Depression, and the one that would do more than any other to establish Morgan's reputation as a figure of national importance, came not in the railroad industry, but in the Treasury of the United States. By early 1895, the federal government was facing a crisis of its own. The drain of gold to Europe had depleted the Treasury's reserves to dangerous levels, and there was growing fear that the government would be forced to suspend gold payments, effectively abandoning the gold standard. Such a suspension would have had catastrophic consequences for American credit abroad, and would have deepened the depression already ravaging the domestic economy. President Grover Cleveland, a conservative Democrat committed to sound money, was desperate to find a way to replenish the gold reserves without resorting to measures that would alarm the financial markets. Morgan traveled to Washington in February 1895 to meet with Cleveland and his Treasury Secretary, John Carlyle. The meeting was tense. Cleveland was reluctant to accept help from a private banker, understanding that any arrangement with Morgan would expose him to criticism from the populist wing of his own party. Morgan was equally determined, having concluded that only decisive action by his firm could prevent a collapse that would damage his own interests as well as those of the nation. According to accounts of the meeting, Morgan informed the president that he knew of a draft for $10 million that was about to be presented for payment in gold, and that if this draft were honored, the treasury would be emptied. Whether this claim was accurate or a negotiating tactic remains unclear, but it had the intended effect. Cleveland agreed to a private bond issue that would bring gold into the treasury and restore confidence in the government's ability to meet its obligations. The terms of the agreement were extraordinarily favorable to Morgan and his associates. A syndicate organized by Morgan and the Rothschild banking house agreed to purchase $65 million in government bonds, paying for them in gold obtained from Europe. The syndicate would then resell the bonds to the public at a profit. The arrangement was legal under an obscure Civil War statute that authorized the Treasury to sell bonds for gold in an emergency, but it was politically explosive. Populists and Silverites denounced Cleveland for selling out the government to Wall Street. Morgan was vilified as a financial dictator who had extracted millions in profit from the nation's distress. The criticism was not entirely unfair. The syndicate did earn substantial profits from the transaction, and the terms were more favorable to the bankers than they would have been in a public offering. But the arrangement also worked. Gold flowed into the treasury, confidence was restored, and the immediate crisis passed. A second bond issue later in 1895, conducted on similar terms, further strengthened the government's position. By 1896, the Treasury's gold reserves had recovered to levels that no longer threatened the stability of the currency. Morgan took considerable satisfaction in the outcome, viewing his intervention as a public service that had prevented a catastrophe. He was contemptuous of the criticism he received, dismissing his populist opponents as demagogues who understood nothing about finance. When questioned about his motives by a congressional committee, he replied simply that he had done what was necessary to preserve the credit of the United States. The gold crisis of 1895 marked a turning point in Morgan's career and in the public perception of his role in the American economy. Before the crisis, he had been known primarily within the financial community as a powerful banker with extensive interests in the railroad industry. After the crisis, he became a national figure, celebrated by some as the savior of the nation's credit and denounced by others as the embodiment of plutocratic power. The episode also revealed the extraordinary weakness of the American financial system, which lacked any central bank or public institution capable of performing the functions that Morgan had been called upon to perform. This weakness would become increasingly apparent in the years to come, as the economy grew in size and complexity, while the institutional framework remained essentially unchanged. The late 1890s brought a gradual recovery from the Depression and a new phase of industrial expansion. The railroad reorganizations of the mid-decade had consolidated Morgan's control over a substantial portion of the nation's transportation network, and his firm was well positioned to profit from the renewed growth. But Morgan's attention was increasingly drawn to opportunities beyond the railroad industry. The same forces that had created the need for consolidation in railroads were at work in other sectors of the economy, and Morgan saw the possibility of applying his methods to manufacturing, mining, and other industries that were beginning to reach the scale at which coordination and organization became essential. The steel industry was a particular object of Morgan's interest. Steel had become the essential material of industrial civilization, used in the construction of railroads, bridges, buildings, ships, and machinery of every description. The American steel industry had grown with extraordinary rapidity since the introduction of the Bessemer process in the 1860s, and by the 1890s, the United States had surpassed Great Britain as the world's leading producer. But the industry was fragmented, with dozens of companies competing in overlapping markets, and exhibited the same tendencies toward overproduction and destructive competition that had plagued the railroads. Morgan believed that the steel industry was ripe for consolidation, and he began to explore the possibilities. The dominant figure in American steel was Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who had built the Carnegie Steel Company into the largest and most efficient producer in the world. Carnegie's methods were the opposite of Morgan's. Where Morgan sought stability through organization and cooperation, Carnegie pursued dominance through relentless cost reduction and aggressive competition. He invested continuously in new technology, drove his workers and managers mercilessly, and used his cost advantages to crush his rivals. By the late 1890s, Carnegie Steel controlled a substantial portion of the American market and was earning profits that exceeded those of most railroads. Carnegie himself was approaching 70 and was beginning to contemplate retirement, but he showed no inclination to sell his company or to participate in any scheme of consolidation that would compromise his independence. The formation of the United States Steel Corporation in 1901 represented the largest business transaction in history up to that point, and marked the definitive emergence of J.P. Morgan as the dominant force in American finance and industry. The consolidation brought together under single ownership the vast steel empire that Andrew Carnegie had built over 4 decades, along with dozens of other companies that controlled iron ore deposits, coal mines, limestone quarries, railroads, steamship lines, and finishing plants scattered across the industrial heartland of the nation. The resulting corporation was capitalized at nearly $1.5 billion, a sum so vast that it strained the comprehension of contemporaries accustomed to thinking of wealth in terms of millions rather than billions. The creation of United States Steel was not merely a financial transaction, but a transformation in the structure of American capitalism, establishing the model of the giant industrial corporation that would dominate the 20th century. The path to this consolidation began in the late 1890s, when Morgan and his partners started acquiring and reorganizing companies in the steel industry, using methods similar to those they had applied to the railroads. In 1898, Morgan participated in the formation of the Federal Steel Company, a combination of several Midwestern steel producers organized by Elbert Gary, a lawyer and judge from Illinois who would become one of Morgan's most trusted associates. Federal Steel was designed to compete with Carnegie by combining producers who individually lacked the scale to challenge the dominant company, but who together might achieve the efficiencies necessary to survive. The following year, Morgan helped organize the National Tube Company and the American Bridge Company, consolidations in specialized segments of the steel industry that followed the same pattern. These combinations represented a direct challenge to Carnegie, and he responded with characteristic aggression. He announced plans to expand into the production of finished steel products, directly competing with the companies Morgan had organized. He threatened to build his own railroad and steamship lines, eliminating his dependence on transportation companies that Morgan controlled. He proposed to construct a massive new plant on the shores of Lake Erie that would be the largest and most efficient steel facility in the world. Whether Carnegie actually intended to carry out all these threats or was simply positioning himself for negotiations remained unclear, but his announcements alarmed the other steel producers and their bankers. A full-scale war between Carnegie and the Morgan-backed combinations would be ruinous for everyone involved, destroying the value of investments that Morgan had worked to protect and plunging the industry back into the chaos from which it had only recently emerged. The resolution came through the intervention of Charles Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel, who delivered a speech at a dinner in New York in December 1900 that outlined a vision of a consolidated steel industry capable of achieving efficiencies and economies of scale that no single company could match. Schwab's speech caught Morgan's attention, and the two men met privately to discuss the possibilities. Morgan was interested but cautious, understanding that any consolidation would require Carnegie's cooperation and that Carnegie's price would be high. He authorized Schwab to approach Carnegie and determine whether a sale was possible. Carnegie's response exceeded Morgan's expectations. The old steelmaker was ready to retire, eager to devote his remaining years to philanthropy and to escape the burdens of managing the vast enterprise he had created. He wrote his terms on a single sheet of paper and handed it to Schwab to convey to Morgan. Carnegie wanted approximately $480 million for his company, paid in bonds of the new corporation rather than cash. The sum was staggering, representing by far the largest payment ever made for a private business, but Morgan accepted it without negotiation. According to accounts of the transaction, when Morgan received Carnegie's terms, he glanced at the paper and said simply that he would accept. There was no haggling, no counterproposal, no extended negotiation. Morgan understood that Carnegie's price, while enormous, was not unreasonable given the value of the properties involved, and he was unwilling to risk losing the deal through protracted bargaining. The formation of United States Steel required months of complex negotiations to bring together the various companies that would compose the new corporation. In addition to Carnegie Steel, the consolidation included Federal Steel, National Tube, American Bridge, American Steel and Wire, American Tin Plate, American Steel Hoop, American Sheet Steel, and several smaller concerns. Each of these companies had its own shareholders, bondholders, and creditors, all of whom needed to be satisfied with the terms of the exchange. Morgan's partners worked through the winter and spring of 1901 to assemble the agreements, draft the corporate documents, and arrange the financing necessary to complete the transaction. The new corporation was formally organized in February 1901, with Morgan's associate Elbert Gary as chairman of the board and Charles Schwab as president. The capitalization of United States Steel immediately became a subject of controversy. Critics charged that the corporation was heavily watered, meaning that its securities were issued in amounts far exceeding the actual value of the underlying assets. The bonds and preferred stock that Carnegie received, for example, represented claims on future earnings that might or might not materialize. The common stock, which was distributed to the shareholders of the constituent companies and to the organizers of the consolidation, had no guaranteed value at all and would be worthless if the corporation failed to generate sufficient profits. Defenders of the consolidation argued that the capitalization reflected not merely the physical assets of the combined companies, but their earning power, their strategic position in the market, and the efficiencies that would result from unified management. The debate over whether United States Steel was overcapitalized would continue for years, but the corporation survived and eventually justified its valuation through decades of profitable operation. Morgan's fees for organizing United States Steel were substantial, but not unreasonable, given the scale and complexity of the transaction. His firm received securities valued at approximately $12 million, along with additional compensation for the various services performed during the months of negotiation and organization. The fees attracted criticism from those who believed that Morgan was extracting excessive profits from transactions that benefited primarily the wealthy, but they were consistent with the compensation that investment bankers typically receive for comparable services. Morgan himself was dismissive of the criticism, viewing his compensation as fair payment for the risks he had assumed and the expertise he had contributed. The creation of United States Steel marked the high point of the consolidation movement that had transformed American industry during the preceding decade. Similar combinations had been organized in dozens of other industries, from sugar refining to tobacco processing to agricultural machinery. The promoters of these consolidations argued that they brought efficiency, stability, and the elimination of wasteful competition. Critics charged that they created monopolies that exploited consumers, suppressed wages, and concentrated economic power in the hands of a small group of financiers. The debate over the merits of industrial consolidation would define American politics for the next generation, pitting the defenders of big business against reformers who sought to restore competition and limit the power of the trusts. Morgan himself had little patience for these debates. He believed that consolidation was the natural and inevitable response to the conditions of modern industry, that large-scale enterprise was inherently more efficient than small-scale competition, and that the men who organized and managed these enterprises were performing a valuable service for society as a whole. He was contemptuous of the politicians and journalists who attacked him, viewing them as ignorant of the realities of business and motivated by envy or ambition rather than genuine concern for the public welfare. When President Theodore Roosevelt announced in 1902 that the federal government would file suit to dissolve the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company that Morgan had organized, Morgan reportedly traveled to Washington to propose that his lawyers and the government's lawyers work together to resolve any problems. Roosevelt's refusal to negotiate, treating Morgan as a lawbreaker rather than a partner, was incomprehensible to a man who had spent his career arranging agreements among powerful parties and who expected the government to deal with him as an equal. The Northern Securities case represented the first significant challenge to Morgan's methods under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The company had been organized in 1901 to hold the stock of the Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads ending a bitter struggle for control of the Northwestern rail network that had threatened to destabilize the financial markets. Morgan believed that the holding company structure was a legitimate and beneficial way to coordinate the operations of the two systems while avoiding the destructive competition that had plagued the industry. The government argued that the combination violated the Sherman Act by restraining trade and creating a monopoly in railroad transportation. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with the government, ordering the dissolution of Northern Securities in 1904, but the practical effects of the decision were limited. The same men who had controlled the railroads before the dissolution continued to control them afterward, and the pattern of cooperation that Morgan had established persisted despite the legal changes. The Northern Securities decision did not fundamentally alter Morgan's position in the American economy, but it signaled a shift in the political environment that would have consequences in the years to come. The progressive movement was gaining strength, fueled by public concern about the power of the trusts and the corruption of political institutions by corporate money. Journalists who came to be known as muckrakers were investigating the practices of big business and publishing exposés that aroused public indignation. Politicians at both the state and federal levels were proposing new regulations designed to limit corporate power and protect consumers, workers, and small competitors. Morgan watched these developments with a mixture of irritation and incomprehension, unable to understand why the public was so ungrateful for the services he had rendered and so eager to interfere with the operations of businesses that were, in his view, managed for the benefit of all. The autumn of 1907 brought the most severe financial crisis the United States had experienced since the Depression of the 1890s, and it would call upon J.P. Morgan to perform once again the role of stabilizer that he had played during the gold crisis of 1895. The panic began in October with the failure of an attempt to corner the stock of the United Copper Company, a speculative scheme that collapsed when the conspirators ran out of money and could not take delivery of the shares they had contracted to purchase. The failure exposed the precarious position of several trust companies that had financed the speculation, and within days, depositors were lining up outside these institutions to withdraw their funds. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest financial institutions in New York, was forced to suspend operations on October 22nd after a run that exhausted its reserves in a matter of hours. The panic spread rapidly, threatening to engulf the entire financial system. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907, and his health had begun to decline. He spent much of his time traveling in Europe, collecting art, and attending to the affairs of the Episcopal Church, in which he was a leading figure. But when the crisis struck, he returned to New York and took personal command of the effort to contain it. For the next 3 weeks, he worked from his library on Madison Avenue, summoning bankers, trust company presidents, and government officials to meetings that often lasted until the early hours of the morning. He assessed the condition of threatened institutions, determined which were solvent and worth saving, and which were beyond rescue, and organized pools of money to provide emergency loans to those he judged viable. His decisions were final and were accepted without question by the other bankers, who understood that Morgan alone possessed the authority and the information necessary to coordinate an effective response. The methods Morgan employed during the panic were improvisational and sometimes coercive. When the Trust Company of America faced a run that threatened to exhaust its reserves, Morgan organized a consortium of banks to provide emergency funding, but only after satisfying himself that the company's assets were sufficient to secure the loans. When the city of New York found itself unable to market bonds necessary to meet its payroll, Morgan arranged for his firm to purchase the entire issue, preventing a default that would have deepened the crisis. When the brokerage firm of Moore & Schley teetered on the edge of collapse, its failure threatening to trigger a cascade of liquidations on the stock exchange, Morgan convened the presidents of the major banks in his library and refused to let them leave until they had agreed to contribute to a rescue fund. According to accounts of that evening, Morgan locked the doors of his library and told the assembled bankers that they would remain until a solution was found. The rescue of Moore & Schley involved a transaction that would later attract considerable scrutiny. The firm's principal asset was a large block of stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, a southern steel producer that had been struggling financially. Morgan proposed that United States Steel acquire Tennessee Coal and Iron, using the cash from the acquisition to pay off Moore & Schley's debts and stabilize the firm. The transaction would strengthen United States Steel's position in the southern market and eliminate a potential competitor, but would also raise antitrust concerns given the size and market dominance of the acquiring company. Morgan dispatched 2 of his partners to Washington to meet with President Roosevelt and obtain assurance that the administration would not challenge the acquisition. Roosevelt, informed that the alternative was a financial collapse that could trigger a nationwide depression, agreed not to oppose the transaction. The acquisition was completed, Moore & Schley was saved, and the immediate crisis passed. The Panic of 1907 lasted approximately 3 weeks, from the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust on October 22 to the restoration of relative stability in mid-November. The damage to the economy was substantial, with numerous bank failures, business bankruptcies, and a sharp contraction in credit that slowed economic activity well into the following year. But the damage could have been far worse. Without Morgan's intervention, the panic might have spiraled into a general collapse comparable to the depressions of 1873 and 1893. The bankers and government officials who participated in the crisis response understood this, and they emerged from the experience with a deepened appreciation of both Morgan's capabilities and the fundamental weakness of a financial system that depended on the leadership of a single private individual. The aftermath of the panic brought renewed calls for reform of the American banking system. The United States was the only major industrial nation without a central bank, an institution that could serve as a lender of last resort during financial crises and provide the kind of coordinated response that Morgan had improvised during the panic. The absence of such an institution meant that the stability of the entire financial system depended on the willingness and ability of private bankers to cooperate in emergencies, a fragile arrangement that had worked in 1907 only because Morgan possessed unique authority and was willing to exercise it. Critics pointed out that Morgan would not live forever, that his successors might not command the same respect, and that the nation could not afford to rely indefinitely on the goodwill of private financiers to prevent financial catastrophe. Congress responded to these concerns by establishing the National Monetary Commission, charged with studying the banking systems of other nations and recommending reforms for the United States. The commission, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a conservative Republican with close ties to the banking community, spent several years investigating the question and ultimately proposed the creation of a central banking institution modeled in part on the European central banks. The proposal was controversial, opposed by populists who fear that it would entrench the power of Wall Street and by bankers who worry that government involvement would politicize monetary policy. The debate would continue for several years, and the Federal Reserve System would not be established until 1913, after Morgan's death. Morgan's role in the Panic of 1907 enhanced his reputation in some quarters and deepened suspicions in others. To his admirers, he was a statesman of finance who had used his power responsibly to prevent a catastrophe that would have harmed millions of Americans. To his critics, he was a plutocrat who had exploited a crisis to strengthen his grip on the economy, extracting concessions from the government and acquiring valuable properties at distressed prices. The Tennessee coal and iron acquisition became a particular focus of criticism, with accusations that Morgan had manipulated the panic to obtain Roosevelt's approval for a transaction that would otherwise have been blocked on antitrust grounds. Morgan denied these accusations, insisting that he had acted in good faith to prevent a collapse that threatened the entire system, but the controversy persisted. The years following the panic were difficult ones for Morgan personally. His health continued to deteriorate, and he suffered from a variety of ailments that limited his energy and forced him to delegate more responsibility to his partners. The political environment had also grown more hostile to the kind of financial power he represented. The progressive movement was at its peak, and public opinion had turned decisively against the trusts and the men who controlled them. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil and the American Tobacco Company, the two largest industrial combinations outside of United States Steel, signaling that the era of unchecked consolidation was coming to an end. Morgan watched these developments with dismay, convinced that the reformers were destroying institutions that had brought efficiency and stability to the American economy. The most painful episode of Morgan's final years was his appearance before the Pujo Committee in December 1912. The committee, a subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee chaired by Representative Arson Pujo of Louisiana, had been investigating the concentration of financial power in the United States, and it summoned Morgan to testify about his role in the so-called money trust. The hearings were contentious and at times hostile, with the committee's counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, pressing Morgan on the extent of his influence over banks, trust companies, railroads, and industrial corporations. Morgan's responses were often evasive or dismissive, reflecting both his contempt for the proceedings and his genuine difficulty in explaining the informal networks of influence through which he operated. The most famous exchange of the hearings came when Untermeyer asked Morgan whether commercial credit was based primarily on money or property. Morgan replied that it was based on neither, that the first thing in credit was character. When Untermeyer pressed him, asking whether a man could obtain credit without money or property, Morgan insisted that he had known cases where loans were made on character alone. The exchange revealed the essence of Morgan's worldview, his conviction that business relationships were fundamentally personal, built on trust and reputation rather than formal rules and regulations. It was a worldview that had served him well throughout his career, but that was increasingly out of step with a society that demanded transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Pujo Committee's final report, issued in February 1913, concluded that a small group of financiers had achieved substantial control over the money and credit of the United States through their positions on the boards of banks, trust companies, insurance companies, railroads, and industrial corporations. The report identified Morgan and his partners as the central figures in this network, documenting the interlocking directorates through which they exercised influence over institutions controlling resources valued at billions of dollars. The report did not accuse Morgan of illegal conduct, but it painted a picture of concentrated financial power that alarmed many Americans and strengthened the case for reform. John Pierpont Morgan died in Rome on March 31, 1913, 2 months after his appearance before the Pujo Committee and just weeks before his 76th birthday. He had traveled to Europe in January, seeking rest and escape from the controversies that had surrounded him during his final months in the United States. His health had been failing for some time, and the strain of the congressional hearings had accelerated his decline. He spent his last weeks in Rome, a city he loved for its art and its history, surrounded by family members and attended by physicians who could do little to reverse the deterioration of his body. The immediate cause of death was reported as a general breakdown of the system, a vague diagnosis that reflected the limited understanding of geriatric medicine at the time, but that accurately captured the gradual failure of an organism that had been pushed beyond its limits. The news of Morgan's death was received with a mixture of respect, relief, and anxiety on both sides of the Atlantic. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 2 hours as a mark of honor, an unprecedented gesture for a private citizen. Flags were lowered on buildings throughout the financial district, and tributes poured in from bankers, industrialists, and government officials who acknowledged Morgan's role in shaping the modern American economy. But there was also uncertainty about what his death would mean for the financial system he had done so much to stabilize. Morgan had been the indispensable man during the crises of 1895 and 1907, the one figure whose authority was sufficient to coordinate the actions of competing institutions and restore confidence to panicked markets. With his passing, the question of who would perform this function in future emergencies became urgent. The estate Morgan left behind was substantial, but smaller than many had expected. His personal fortune was estimated at approximately $80 million, a large sum by any ordinary measure but modest compared to the wealth accumulated by contemporaries like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Morgan had never been primarily interested in accumulating money for its own sake. His passion was for power and influence, for the ability to shape events and impose order on the chaos of the market. He had spent lavishly on his art collection, his yachts, his houses, and his charitable activities, and he had never hesitated to use his own resources to support transactions that he believed were in the public interest. The relative modesty of his estate surprised those who had assumed that the most powerful banker in America must also be the richest, but was consistent with the priorities that had guided his career. The art collection Morgan assembled was extraordinary, one of the finest private collections ever created in America and a testament to his taste, his wealth, and his ambition to elevate American culture to European standards. He had collected paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, rare books, tapestries, porcelains, and decorative arts from every period and every civilization, housing them in a magnificent library he had built adjacent to his home on Madison Avenue. The library itself, designed by the architect Charles McKim, was a masterpiece of Renaissance Revival architecture, its walls lined with rare volumes, and its galleries filled with treasures that rivaled those of the great European museums. Morgan had intended the collection to remain together after his death, and his son and heir, J.P. Morgan Jr., honored this wish by donating a substantial portion of it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other institutions. The firm Morgan had built survived his death and continued to operate under the leadership of his partners, who had been carefully selected and trained over many years. J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, assumed his father's position as the senior partner, but he lacked his father's commanding presence and personal authority. The younger Morgan was competent and conscientious, but he did not possess the intuitive genius for finance that had made his father unique. The firm remained powerful and profitable, but would never again exercise the kind of influence over the American economy that it had wielded during the elder Morgan's lifetime. The era of personal financial leadership was giving way to an era of institutions, regulations, and government oversight. The Federal Reserve Act, signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in December 1913, 8 months after Morgan's death, created the central banking system that reformers had long advocated. The new Federal Reserve System was designed to provide the functions that Morgan had performed during the panics of 1895 and 1907, serving as a lender of last resort, managing the money supply, and coordinating the response to financial emergencies. The creation of the Federal Reserve did not eliminate the role of private bankers in the financial system, but it fundamentally altered the balance of power between public and private institutions. No longer would the stability of the American economy depend on the willingness of a single private individual to intervene in a crisis. The government now had the tools and the authority to act on its own. The transformation of American finance that began with the Federal Reserve Act continued in the decades following Morgan's death. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened the government's ability to challenge anti-competitive practices and prohibited interlocking directorates of the kind that the Pujo Committee had documented. The banking reforms of the New Deal era, enacted in response to the Great Depression, separated commercial banking from investment banking, created deposit insurance, and imposed new regulations designed to prevent the speculative excesses that had contributed to the crash of 1929. These reforms collectively dismantled much of the structure that Morgan had built, replacing the informal networks of personal influence with formal rules and bureaucratic oversight. The House of Morgan, as the firm came to be known, adapted to these changes but never regained the dominant position it had occupied during the founder's lifetime. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced the firm to choose between commercial banking and investment banking, and it chose to remain in the deposit-taking business, spinning off its securities operations into a separate firm that became Morgan Stanley. J.P. Morgan and Company continued as a commercial bank, serving corporate clients and wealthy individuals, but it no longer played the central role in organizing industrial combinations and reorganizing bankrupt enterprises that had made it famous. The firm remained respected and profitable, but was one institution among many in an increasingly regulated and competitive financial industry. The legacy of J.P. Morgan extended far beyond the specific transactions he orchestrated or the institutions he controlled. He had demonstrated that finance could be a creative and constructive force, capable of organizing the resources necessary to build railroads, manufacture steel, and develop the infrastructure of an industrial economy. He had shown that private initiative could sometimes accomplish what government could not, mobilizing capital and coordinating action in ways that no public institution of his era was equipped to do. But he had also revealed the dangers of concentrated financial power, the temptation to use that power for private gain at public expense, and the inadequacy of a system that depended on the goodwill of private individuals to serve the public interest. The debates that surrounded Morgan during his lifetime continued long after his death. Defenders of his legacy argue that he had brought order to a chaotic economy, stabilized industries that were destroying themselves through competition, and prevented financial catastrophes that would have harmed millions of Americans. Critics counter that he had extracted excessive profits from his position as gatekeeper to the capital markets, suppressed competition in ways that harmed consumers and workers, and exercised power that was incompatible with democratic governance. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, and the tension between them has never been fully resolved. The financial panics that Morgan helped to contain in 1895 and 1907 were not the last such crises in American history. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, and the financial crisis of 2008 all demonstrated that the problems Morgan confronted remained endemic to the capitalist system. Each crisis prompted new reforms and new regulations, but none succeeded in eliminating the fundamental instability that arises when credit expands faster than the productive capacity of the economy. The question of how to balance the benefits of financial innovation against the risks of financial excess, how to harness the creative power of capital while controlling its destructive potential, remained as urgent at the end of the 20th century as it had been at the beginning. Morgan himself would have been skeptical of the regulatory apparatus that emerged in the decades after his death. He believed in personal responsibility, in the judgment of experienced men who understood the realities of business and could be trusted to act in the long-term interest of the institutions they controlled. He distrusted government intervention, which he saw as motivated by political considerations rather than sound business judgment. He would have found the modern financial system, with its layers of regulation and its armies of compliance officers, alien and uncongenial. But he might also have recognized that the system he created could not survive indefinitely, that the concentration of power he represented was ultimately incompatible with the democratic values of the society in which he operated, and that some form of public oversight was inevitable once the economy had grown beyond the capacity of any private individual to manage. The world that Morgan had known and shaped underwent a profound transformation in the years following his death, as the structures of 19th-century capitalism gave way to new forms of economic organization. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, just 17 months after Morgan's passing, created demands on the financial system that dwarfed anything that had come before and demonstrated both the enduring importance of the institution he had built and the limitations of the methods he had employed. The House of Morgan, now led by his son Jack, found itself at the center of an unprecedented mobilization of capital, arranging loans to the Allied powers that would total hundreds of millions of dollars and helping to finance the industrial expansion necessary to supply the armies fighting in Europe. The war loans arranged by J.P. Morgan and Company were controversial from the beginning. The United States was officially neutral in the conflict, and many Americans, particularly those of German and Irish descent, opposed any involvement that might benefit Great Britain and France. The Morgan firm's close ties to British finance, dating back to the partnership between Junius Morgan and George Peabody, made it a natural intermediary for Allied borrowing, but this role also exposed it to accusations of profiteering and of dragging the nation toward war. When the United States finally entered the conflict in April 1917, the Morgan loans were vindicated as prescient preparation for a struggle that the nation could not avoid, but the controversy left lasting suspicions about the relationship between Wall Street and foreign policy. The wartime experience accelerated changes in the financial system that had begun before Morgan's death. The scale of the financing required to support the war effort far exceeded the capacity of private bankers acting alone, and the federal government assumed a central role in mobilizing capital through the sale of Liberty bonds directly to the public. The Federal Reserve System, still in its infancy when the war began, proved its value by coordinating monetary policy and facilitating the flow of credit to essential industries. The war demonstrated that modern industrial warfare required a level of coordination between government and business that was incompatible with the laissez-faire principles of the Gilded Age, and it established precedents for government intervention in the economy that would be invoked repeatedly in the decades to come. The 1920s brought a period of apparent prosperity that masked underlying weaknesses in the economic structure. The stock market rose to unprecedented heights, driven by speculative enthusiasm and the easy availability of credit. New industries, particularly automobiles and electrical equipment, generated genuine growth, but much of the market's advance reflected speculation rather than underlying value. The banking system, despite the reforms of the Progressive Era, remained fragmented and vulnerable, with thousands of small banks operating without adequate supervision or capital reserves. The optimism of the era encouraged risk-taking and discouraged caution, creating conditions remarkably similar to those that had preceded the panics of Morgan's time. The crash of October 1929 and the depression that followed exposed the fragility of the financial system that had emerged from the progressive reforms. The Federal Reserve, which had been created to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe, proved unable or unwilling to act with sufficient force to contain the crisis. Banks failed by the thousands, wiping out the savings of millions of depositors. Unemployment reached levels not seen since the worst years of the 19th century. The economic collapse discredited the business leadership that had guided the prosperity of the 1920s and created an opening for more radical approaches to economic management. The House of Morgan did not escape the opprobrium that attached to Wall Street in the aftermath of the crash. Congressional investigations, reminiscent of the Pujo hearings 2 decades earlier, examined the practices of the major banks and investment houses, uncovering conflicts of interest, self-dealing, and disregard for the welfare of small investors. The Pecora hearings of 1933, named for the committee's counsel Ferdinand Pecora, were particularly damaging, revealing that partners of J.P. Morgan and Company had been given opportunities to purchase securities at favorable prices that were not available to ordinary investors. The revelations were embarrassing rather than criminal, but they reinforced the public perception that the financial elite operated by rules different from those that applied to everyone else. The regulatory response to the Depression transformed the financial industry more thoroughly than anything that had occurred during Morgan's lifetime. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 required the separation of commercial banking from investment banking, forcing institutions to choose one business or the other. J.P. Morgan and Company elected to remain a commercial bank, surrendering its securities business to the newly formed Morgan Stanley and Company. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 imposed disclosure requirements and created the Securities and Exchange Commission to oversee the securities markets. The Banking Act of 1935 strengthened the Federal Reserve and gave it clearer authority to manage monetary policy. Together, these reforms created a regulatory framework that would govern American finance for the next half-century. The Morgan Bank that emerged from the Depression era was a different institution from the one the founder had built. It remained prestigious and profitable, serving the financial needs of major corporations and wealthy families, but it no longer occupied the commanding position in the financial system that it had held during the founder's lifetime. The interlocking directorates that had given Morgan influence over dozens of corporations were prohibited by law. The ability to organize giant industrial combinations was constrained by antitrust enforcement. The role of lender of last resort had been assumed by the Federal Reserve. The bank adapted to these changes, finding new opportunities in areas that remained open to private initiative, but it could no longer aspire to the kind of systemic importance that had made the elder Morgan a figure of national significance. The second half of the 20th century brought further transformations that would have been difficult for Morgan to imagine. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established a new international monetary system, with the dollar replacing gold as the foundation of global finance and international institutions assuming responsibilities that had previously been exercised by private bankers. The post-war decades saw the rise of institutional investors, pension funds, and mutual funds that accumulated capital on a scale that dwarfed the resources of any individual or partnership. The globalization of finance created new opportunities and new risks, as capital flowed across borders with increasing freedom and financial innovations proliferated beyond the ability of regulators to understand or control. The Morgan Bank itself underwent repeated transformations during this period. In 1959, it merged with the Guaranty Trust Company to form Morgan Guaranty Trust, combining two institutions with deep roots in American financial history. The merger created one of the largest banks in the country and positioned the firm to compete in an era of increasing consolidation. Later decades brought additional changes, as the regulatory barriers erected during the Depression era were gradually dismantled and financial institutions were permitted to engage in activities that had been prohibited for generations. The repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 allowed commercial banks to re-enter the securities business, reversing the separation that had been imposed 6 decades earlier. The financial crisis of 2008 provided a stark reminder that the problems Morgan had confronted a century earlier remained unresolved. The collapse of major financial institutions, the freezing of credit markets, and the threat of a general economic breakdown evoked comparisons to the panics of 1893 and 1907. The response to the crisis also echoed the past, with government officials and private bankers working together to contain the damage and restore confidence. The scale of the intervention was far greater than anything Morgan could have organized, requiring trillions of dollars in government support, but the underlying dynamic was familiar. Once again, institutions that were considered too interconnected to fail had to be rescued to prevent a catastrophe that would harm the entire economy. The firm that bore Morgan's name was itself transformed by the crisis of 2008. J.P. Morgan Chase, the institution created through the merger of J.P. Morgan and Company with Chase Manhattan Bank in 2000, emerged as one of the largest and most powerful financial institutions in the world. The firm acquired Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual during the crisis, expanding its reach and consolidating its position in ways that recalled the acquisitions Morgan had orchestrated a century earlier. The concentration of financial power in a small number of giant institutions raised concerns about systemic risk and prompted debates about regulation that echoed the controversies of the Progressive era. The questions that Morgan's career had raised about the relationship between private finance and public welfare remained as relevant as ever. The story of J.P. Morgan is ultimately the story of a particular moment in the development of American capitalism, a period when the scale of industrial enterprise outstripped the capacity of existing institutions to organize and finance it, and when a single individual could accumulate sufficient power to shape the structure of the economy. Morgan occupied a position that was unprecedented before his time and that has never been replicated since, standing at the intersection of American industry and European capital, commanding the trust of investors on both sides of the Atlantic and wielding influence over enterprises that touch nearly every aspect of economic life. His career spanned the transformation of the United States from an agricultural republic into an industrial power, and he was not merely a witness to this transformation but one of its principal architects. The methods Morgan employed reflected the circumstances of his era. In the absence of effective regulation, without a central bank to manage the money supply or coordinate responses to financial emergencies, the stability of the system depended on informal arrangements among the men who controlled the major institutions. Morgan's genius lay in his ability to create and maintain these arrangements, to command the confidence of rivals and competitors, and to impose discipline on industries that would otherwise have destroyed themselves through uncoordinated competition. His power derived not from legal authority or government sanction, but from the trust that others placed in his judgment and his word. When he said that credit was based on character, he was describing not an abstract principle, but the foundation of his own career. The limitations of this system were evident even during Morgan's lifetime. The concentration of power in private hands was incompatible with democratic accountability and created opportunities for abuse that could not be effectively policed. The stability that Morgan provided was contingent on his continued presence and his willingness to act, leaving the system vulnerable to disruption whenever he was unavailable or incapacitated. The informal networks through which he operated were opaque to outsiders, making it impossible for the public to understand how decisions were being made or to hold decision-makers responsible for their choices. These limitations became increasingly apparent as the economy grew in size and complexity, and they ultimately made reform inevitable regardless of whether the reformers fully understood the system they were replacing. The regulatory framework that emerged in the decades after Morgan's death addressed many of these limitations but created new problems of its own. The separation of commercial banking from investment banking reduced conflicts of interest but also fragmented the financial system and created gaps in oversight. The growth of government involvement in the economy provided new tools for managing crises, but also introduced political considerations into decisions that had previously been made on purely commercial grounds. The expansion of disclosure requirements and investor protections democratized access to the capital markets, but also imposed costs and constraints that limited the flexibility of financial institutions. Each reform brought benefits and costs, and the balance between them has been contested ever since. The figure of Morgan himself has been interpreted and reinterpreted by successive generations, each finding in his career evidence for its own preoccupations and concerns. To the progressives of his own era, he represented the dangerous concentration of economic power that threatened democratic institutions and demanded aggressive government intervention. To the business conservatives of later decades, he embodied the creative potential of private enterprise and the ability of markets to organize complex activities without government direction. To historians of finance, he remains a pivotal figure in the development of modern banking, the man who demonstrated that financial intermediation could be a source of value creation rather than merely a parasitic extraction of fees. To critics of capitalism, he stands as an example of how wealth and power reinforce each other, creating dynasties that perpetuate inequality across generations. The physical legacy Morgan left behind offers tangible evidence of his wealth, his taste, and his aspirations. The Morgan Library, now a public museum, preserves a collection of rare books, manuscripts, and art objects that he assembled over decades of collecting. The works he donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art form a significant portion of that institution's holdings and establish standards for American collecting that influenced generations of philanthropists. The buildings he financed, the institutions he supported, and the traditions he established continue to shape cultural life in New York and beyond. These contributions reflected Morgan's conviction that wealth carried responsibilities as well as privileges, that those who had benefited from the American system owed something in return to the society that had made their success possible. The financial institutions that trace their lineage to Morgan's firm continue to occupy prominent positions in the global economy. J.P. Morgan Chase, the direct descendant of the bank Morgan founded, ranks among the largest financial institutions in the world by nearly every measure, with assets measured in trillions of dollars and operations spanning every continent. Morgan Stanley, the investment bank created when Glass-Steagall forced the separation of the securities business, has grown into a global financial services firm with its own substantial presence in markets around the world. These institutions operate on a scale that Morgan could not have imagined, employing technologies that did not exist during his lifetime and serving clients whose needs bear little resemblance to those of the railroad companies and industrial corporations that were his principal concerns. Yet they continue to bear his name, and they continue to trade on the reputation for integrity and reliability that he worked to establish. The questions that Morgan's career raised about the relationship between finance and the broader economy remain unresolved more than a century after his death. The financial system continues to experience periodic crises that reveal the fragility of institutions that appear stable in normal times. The concentration of economic power in large financial institutions continues to generate concern about systemic risk and democratic accountability. The tension between the creative potential of financial innovation and its capacity for destruction continues to challenge regulators and policymakers. The role of private finance in allocating capital and organizing economic activity continues to be debated by those who see markets as efficient mechanisms for coordinating complex activities and those who see them as sources of instability and inequality. Morgan himself would likely have viewed these ongoing debates with the same combination of impatience and incomprehension that he displayed toward the reformers of his own era. He believed that he understood how the economy worked, that his methods were sound, and that his motives were honorable. He saw himself as a builder and an organizer, a man who created value by bringing together the resources necessary for great enterprises and ensuring that they were managed responsibly. He had little patience for those who questioned his judgment or challenged his authority, and he never fully understood why the public was so suspicious of the power he exercised. In this, as in much else, he was a man of his time, shaped by the circumstances of the Gilded Age, and unable to anticipate the transformations that would make his methods obsolete. The era Morgan dominated was one of extraordinary creativity and extraordinary destruction, a period when fortunes were made and lost with bewildering speed, and when the economic landscape was reshaped by forces that no one fully understood or controlled. Morgan brought a measure of order to this chaos, imposing discipline on industries that were tearing themselves apart and providing stability during crises that threatened to bring down the entire system. His methods were imperfect, his motives were mixed, and his legacy is contested, but his impact on American economic development was profound and enduring. He demonstrated that finance could be a constructive force, capable of organizing resources and coordinating activities on a scale that would otherwise be impossible. He also demonstrated the dangers of concentrating such power in private hands, dangers that his successors have struggled to address ever since. The story of J.P. Morgan is not a simple tale of heroism or villainy, but a complex account of how one man navigated the contradictions of an economic system that rewarded ambition and innovation while punishing excess and miscalculation. He succeeded on terms that his contemporaries understood and admired, accumulating power and influence that made him one of the most important figures of his age. He also provoked opposition and criticism that revealed the limitations of his vision and the costs of his methods. In the end, he was neither the savior his admirers proclaimed nor the predator his critics denounced, but something more complicated and more human, a man of extraordinary ability and ordinary failings who left his mark on a nation still grappling with the consequences of his choices.